Thank you very much. That was a really lovely introduction, and thank you for inviting me here to give this lecture. It's a pleasure. Yep. So I'm here today to talk about metaphor and advertising, and as Danny kind of hinted at, I'm also here to talk a lot about metonymy as well. So before I get into the outline of the talk, just to very briefly introduce those two concepts. I take it most people here are familiar with the idea of metaphor, yeah, where you talk about one thing in terms of another. So if you go out of this talk and you say, oh, Jeannette, she was a real monster, that means that you're applying concepts from monsters to me. So I was like horrible, scary, awful, ugly, etc. Hopefully that's not what you will say. So the idea there is that with metaphor, you've got one thing being compared to another. I'm also getting very interested in metonymy, as Danny said, and metonymy will also feature quite prominently in this talk. Are you familiar with this concept of metonymy? Some people, yes, some people, maybe it's a bit of a new thing. So whereas metaphor, you compare one thing to another, and it's two very, very different things, with metonymy, you're sort of using one entity to refer to another more closely related entity. So you haven't got this difference that you have in metaphor. So for example, people might talk about Hollywood to mean the American film industry, particularly the tacky end of the American film industry. Or they might use a 9/11 to refer metonymically to what happened on 9/11. Yeah? So these are metonymies. And I'm going to be talking a bit more about that in the talk because I'm interested in the interaction between metaphor and metonymy in advertising. So they can't be here today, but this talk is I'm going to be talking about work that I'm doing alongside two colleagues, Paola Perez Sobrino and David Houghton, and we're working together on a European Union, probably one of the last European Union funded projects that people in the UK can have. And the project is exploring multimodal metaphor in advertising. This is the sort of summary of the people involved in the project. So this is us, the research team at the top. Paola and I both work in linguistics, but David works in the business school at the University of Birmingham, particularly in the marketing department. So he brings in all the marketing expertise to prevent us from saying silly things about marketing that everybody knows already. Then we've got colleagues from China and Spain, because the project is looking at the ways in which adverts which are intended for international audiences are understood by people in the UK, in China and in Spain. So we're doing the study in these three countries. It's mainland China. And then we're hooked up with the Netherlands, because in the Netherlands at the University of Amsterdam, there's a very well-known metaphor lab where they study metaphor and work on techniques for identifying and analysing metaphor. So we've got close links with them, and we visited them a few times to discuss the methodology. And we've also got some advertising agencies involved, because now I think, talking to a few of you, it's the same in Hong Kong. Our research is all about impact on the real world, yeah? So we have applied elements to this. So that's the project. The project is called Exploring Multimodal Metaphor and Metonymy in Advertising. I'm going to talk today about two studies that we're doing as part of the project. One of them I mentioned to those of you who were at my talk yesterday. I mentioned that talk. I'm going to go over some of the things from that again for the benefit of people who were not here yesterday. And then the majority of the talk is going to be talking about a second study that focused on viral adverts. So whereas the first one is talking about these sort of static billboard type adverts, the second one is these videos that go online and they go massive and they have millions and millions of views. And we're looking at why it is that some of them are really popular and everybody sends them on to their friends and thinks they're really great, and other ones just die. And we're looking to see if there's anything to do with figurative language which might explain the popularity. And we think there is. Well, we hope there is. So the first study looking at the different kind of the static adverts, the billboard adverts. What we're interested in here is the idea of figurative complexity. So when we look at adverts for things, we see that there's nearly always some kind of metaphor or metonymy. Sometimes it's very simple, as in this advert. This is an example of what we would describe as metonymy, because it's the Grand Canyon is simply standing for Arizona. So it's standing for something that it's very closely related to. Not very figurative, yeah? But as you move along the cline, you get more and more figurative adverts, more complexity. So here, I don't know if you can see this advert very well. This is an advert for internet security. And you've got all the fences here, and you've got the security guards behind the fences. And then the whole thing looks like the internet sign, yeah? So here you've got sort of a very straightforward single metaphor. Whereas here, in this advert for Audi cars, I don't know if you've seen this advert. It's on here, you can see what? What would you say they are? Yeah. So eyebrows, did somebody say? Yeah, so two eyebrows, yeah. Or eyelashes, maybe, yeah, eyelashes. So indicating that the car is, do they look like male or female eyelashes? Very quite female, yeah? So the car is a woman, so you've got that kind of going on. But do they look like anything else?
Dials?
Yeah, dials. Yeah, so for me, I would see these as speedometers, yeah? Now, for people who actually know more about cars than me, one is a speedometer and one is a rev counter, yeah? But I would see two speedometers here. And so there's a possibility of interpreting this as, because there are two speedometers, Audis are maybe twice as fast as the other cars, yeah? So that's one interpretation you might have of it. Also, if you notice, there are no dials here. So there's speedometers, but there's no dial. So as we know in Germany, there are no limits to the speed on the motorways, so maybe Audi is unlimited speed. So in this one, it's easier to see multiple metaphors going on. So this is what we would say here is a metaphorical complex. So there's lots of metaphors going on in the single advert. And we're interested in looking at this continuum of complexity and seeing whether it affects people's appreciation of adverts, whether they are faster to understand the simple ones than the more complex ones, and whether people are able to see the complexity that we as analysts see. This is always a big issue in analysing metaphor. As an analyst, you look at it and you say, I can see this, 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 and this. Whereas participants would look at it and say, no, there's no metaphor there. I don't see it at all. Because people will really vary in what they see as metaphor. So in this first study, we're looking at, does figurative complexity relate to speed of comprehension? And here we had adverts that we showed to English, Spanish and Chinese participants. And we were interested in, do they understand the simple ones more quickly than the complex ones? We theorized that they would. Does figurative complexity relate to the perceived effectiveness of the advert? So do people like ones which have lots and lots and lots of metaphor in them or not? Because advertising agencies obviously spend quite a lot of time and money putting together these adverts, so we want to know if they're effective or not. Does figurative complexity, as we perceive it as analysts, does that relate to how complex, how many different kinds of meanings people come up with when we give them to participants? So is there kind of validity in our own analysis? Does the perceived effectiveness relate to speed of comprehension? So is it that the faster people understand it, the more they like it? And then all of that, does it vary according to the linguistic and cultural background of the reader? So these are the research questions in this first study. For each advert, we have 4 measures. So we had 24 adverts in this study, and we rated them all first of all for figurative complexity, with 2 raters and a 3rd rater coming in to help in cases where we weren't sure. So this is basically how much metaphor and metonymy is going on in this advert. The second one, perceived effectiveness of the advert. So we showed people a number of showed them the adverts and asked them just to rate how effective they thought the advert would be. So it's perceived effectiveness. It's not actual effectiveness because we don't know how many people went out and bought the product as a result of this. That could be different. Speed of comprehension. So this is a reaction time study looking at how long it takes people to find the meaning in the advert. And the fourth one, complexity of understanding. So here what we did was we interviewed each of the participants and we asked them to say as many meanings as they could come up with for the advert. And we kept asking, saying, and anything else, anything else, anything else, until we became annoying and they just told us to shut up and move on to the next one. So there are our 4 measures. And this is the details. I should say this is the kind of an initial study that we're doing here. We've got a bigger version of it that I'll talk about in a minute that we're in the process of conducting. So 26 adverts, 30 participants, reaction time study using, I don't know if any of you have used this DMDX software for reaction time. We were really excited because it was free and it was online and we downloaded it. Utter nightmare to use. I wouldn't recommend that people use it in future. It involves a lot of computer programming and things. There are now other packages that you can use which are much easier. Effectiveness ratings and interview data, which we analysed using this Uam Corpus Tool, which I will give more information about later on. Is anyone familiar with that? It's also this is a really good free download, which I will talk about later on, for analysing this kind of data. So we basically calculated correlations between the different variables, and our first hypothesis was that figurative complexity would relate to speed of comprehension. Absolutely not. No relationship at all. So we were wrong here. And I think thinking about it, there are all sorts of reasons why that is the case, because it could be that even though an advert is complex, the minute people reach one understanding, they're fine with it. They don't need to go on and understand all of the meanings in the advert. So people maybe don't necessarily process all of the metaphors that are in the advert. Does figurative complexity relate to the perceived effectiveness of the advert? So remember, our hypothesis here was that the more complex, the more people would think it was effective. Well, yes, there was a relationship, but it was in the complete opposite direction to what we predicted. So here, again, we were wrong. So the more complex the advert, the less people liked it. I think this is quite interesting because it says to advertisers that they put all this time and effort into making a figuratively complex advert. People don't particularly like it, and they don't spend any time trying to understand it. Anyway, so it's quite interesting findings for the advertising agencies that we're working with here. The third thing, a bit more reassuring, our measures of figurative complexity, they related strongly to those of the participants produced. So this is good because this suggests that when we as analysts identify metaphor and metonymy, there is a correlation between what we and the participants in the study see in the adverts. And so that was reassuring. We weren't just kind of making up our own views of what's in there. Does the perceived effectiveness relate to speed of comprehension? Yes. So the ones that the participants liked, they understood very quickly. So it could be that because they understood them quickly, they liked them, or because they liked them, they understood them quickly. With correlation, you never know which is the cause and which is the effect. But it seems to be that the overall sort of take-home message from this early preliminary study is keep it simple with figurative complexity. It's a shame for us metaphor specialists because we love to see lots and lots of metaphor, but it's saying perhaps it's not a good idea to have lots and lots of metaphor. They were the first 4 questions. Now, as I mentioned, we were looking at this, we gave these adverts to English, Spanish and Chinese participants. And we were interested in kind of different responses that they gave. And here we found some interesting things. Now I'd just like to introduce, before going into this, the Uam Corpus Tool. This is Mark Radcliffe is the name of the guy who put this together. And he is a very approachable guy. If you have any problems with him, you can email him and he gets back to you straight away. And it's a free download. What it lets you do is code your data. So you feed the corpus, upload a corpus into the tool. So we uploaded the transcripts of all our interviews into it. We highlighted interpretations that we thought were of different types of interpretations, and then it codes them, and it allows you to make statistical comparisons between, say, for example, English, Spanish, Chinese participants, and tells you which kinds of responses are more common, significantly more common with one group than another. So it's a really nice, easy to use tool. It also has a device in it where it allows you to measure the positivity ratings of your language. This is slightly strange. So it can tell you whether overall the language is kind of more positive, neutral, or negative. So inside the tool, it's got a kind of dictionary behind it. So if for example, it comes across a word happy, it codes that as positive. Table, neutral, bad, negative. It's very crude, but because it's dealing with such a lot of data, it's actually quite powerful and quite interesting. And what we found here was that of the participants, the Spanish were the most enthusiastic, the most positive responses to the adverts. The English, kind of medium, and the Chinese also sort of not so positive towards the adverts. And this, interestingly, correlates with findings in the literature that have also looked at positivity biases in language in general, and they're in the same order as those, which is quite a strange thing, I think. Just as an example of the responses, here we have the Audi advert again, and looking at, here we have the significant differences between the types of responses. So the Chinese participants are more likely to talk about it having unlimited possibilities. English, very typical of us, we talk about saving fuel, okay, so not wasting too much petrol. And the Spanish, super enthusiastic, their Audis are friendly cars, so that's a kind of positive thing. So this is quite a nice thing that we were able to find using that tool. Some of the more qualitative findings from this study now. Here, so this is an advert for Boddingtons beer, and it says here, Boddingtons, the cream of Manchester. We were talking about this with the group yesterday on how this is actually a disgusting idea for people outside the UK who don't necessarily want beer to be creamy because of the different types of beer that we have in different countries. And so here, this idea that it's got this kind of 1950s hair, yeah? It's because the Boddingtons is largely, but not entirely, a beer for kind of older men in the UK. And here we have different interpretations. So the English are more likely to report that the beer is creamy. That's just because that's what we like. So here, with the metaphor, we're drawing on kind of what we're expecting to find. Chinese are more likely to report that the beer is for young men, whereas English and Spanish are more likely to report that it's for old men. So here we've got the same advert, but being understood in very different ways by people with different cultural backgrounds, which I think is interesting. Here we've got an advert for 7-Up. Now this advert is now illegal. It's now been banned because it's sending a false impression that 7-Up is actually healthy. It's not healthy at all. And if we look at the responses, the English participants are more likely to describe it as healthy. So we're the stupid ones who fall for it completely. Spanish are more likely to say it's sweet. This is an interesting one. This is for Nvivo. Can you see what's going on here? What's in the here? Yeah, like a pause. Good. Yeah. So on one hand, it's like when the nice feeling when you put your hand in the new Nivea and you make the very satisfying first, yeah. But also, it's a pause. Yeah. Interestingly, the Chinese participants saw a power socket, because it is in China. This is the power socket. Yeah. But it makes sense. It makes sense because then the power socket gives you electricity, energy, and keeps you going for longer. So this is the thing about once you put a meaning out there in a metaphor, in an advert, you've no really control over what people are going to understand by that meaning. And that becomes increasingly apparent as we do these kinds of studies. You can't predict what people are going to see in these adverts. Also, the Chinese are more likely to comment on the significance of the blue colour as well, which I think there could be cultural reasons for that. We're not sure. We don't want to kind of, in the study, we don't want to generalise too much, but we just want to sort of illustrate that there are very big differences in terms of how people see these adverts. And the last one, this is also Audi. So you see marriage here, and then Audi, which is a bit stronger. And here the rings are interlinked, whereas here they are just sitting on top of each other, so not as close a relationship. Yes, it's sad. Yeah. So the English and Spanish are more likely to notice that they're not linked, so that owning an Audi is twice as good as being married, whereas the Chinese are more likely to say that love for the car is an emotional or powerful relationship. Again, these differences. It's quite nice. It sort of illustrates how useful this tool is for showing differences in interpretations. Some of them you can kind of explain or kind of attempt to explain. Other ones like this, it's very difficult to say why this is, but I think it's useful for advertisers to have this kind of information when they're putting their adverts out there. So they're the different interpretations. What we're doing now, this was a study with just 30 participants and with 24 adverts, and it had some things in the study that were not so good. So one problem possibly with the study is that all the adverts were in English. So the poor old Spanish and Chinese were obliged to read the adverts in English. This could have had all sorts of impact on the reaction times and everything. So we're running a bigger version of the study with 90 participants, 30 adverts. People are going to be people have been looking at, because we've collected the data, we haven't analysed it all yet. People are looking at adverts in their own language, so we translate them into their own language, and they're doing it in their own countries, so it's not in the UK. We're doing the study in China, in Spain, and in the UK. So here we've got more participants, adverts in the L1, translated with the same typography and the colours retained. So here, this is a really nice advert from China for light bulb, and so that's what the Chinese people see. The English people see this, and the Spanish people see a Spanish equivalent. So lazy, replace it immediately. This is nice because it has lots of examples of, there's a metonymy here, because you've got the tie and the trousers providing kind of mental access to the idea of a businessman, yeah. But you've also got the metaphor in that the kind of fat light bulb is compared to the fat belly on the businessman. So you've got both things here. It's going to be in the participants' own countries. A wider range of figurative operations, so not just metaphor and metonymy, we're also including some hyperbole here. So this is a lovely advert, again from China, an advert for, well, what do you think it's for? I stand in front of the thing. It's hard to see, yeah? Any ideas? I would have thought detergent at first. It's actually for insect repellent. Because, yeah, it's nice, isn't it? So the insect repellent is so strong that you're completely disappeared. So here you've got hyperbole. In that you're not there as well. And then also we've got another hyperbole here. This is one for a hairdryer. It's so strong that it kind of knocks you out. Interestingly, we've done a little bit of preliminary analysis on the findings from these adverts, and we're finding that the females in the advert, in the study, really like this advert and they get it straight away, whereas the males are saying, why would you want a hairdryer that knocks you out? Whereas we women, we know we want our hairdryer really quickly in the morning and we don't want to spend time doing it. So there's interesting gender things. Gender's not a primary focus of the study, but I think there will be interesting things coming out of it. Another thing we're building into this study is this individual differences variable of need for cognition. So need for cognition, it's been shown that there are some people who are perfectly happy with the first understanding and then that's fine, and then they go away. Yeah. Other people who need to see more, who want to think more, want to process more of the advert. And so we think that this was probably a variable that was quite strong in the preliminary study, but we didn't look at it in detail. So this time we've included a questionnaire, a need for cognition questionnaire. So it has things like this. I would rather do something that requires little thought than something that's sure to challenge my thinking abilities. I'm not sure if many people would click yes to that, but that's a kind of lack of need for cognition question. And then I find satisfaction in deliberating hard and for long hours. And there are lots and lots of questions like this. One issue with this is it's self-report data. And with self-report data, you never really know how accurate it is. But still, we think it will provide an individual differences perspective on the study that wasn't in the pilot. And then the next thing that we're doing as part of the Emma project, so the Exploring Multimodal Metaphor in Advertising, and this moves me on to the second part of the talk, is this focus on viral videos, these videos that have gone mad. Yeah? And also, even though we haven't developed the, analysed the findings yet, we're looking at the role of emotion. So we're using one of these things, these kind of scary looking things that you attach to people's hands, EDA, electrodermal activity. It basically measures, allegedly measures a person's emotional response to a stimulus. And it's measured basically by measuring the amount of sweat that's produced on their hands. Yeah? And then that creates an electric current, and that shows how strong an emotional response there is to the advert. There have been studies showing that when all other things being equal, people respond significantly more strongly to metaphor than they do to literal language per se. But we're interested in why that is. Is it because it's just metaphor, or is it the content of the metaphor that we're looking at, or is it personal things that they're bringing it to? So we're going to interview as well as doing that. But moving on to this side, the viral videos, this is how viral videos have been described. And I think they're increasingly popular in branding and marketing. So I just like this quote: "A digitalized sneeze that releases millions of tiny particles that can infect others who come into contact with them." So the idea that it just goes worldwide, it goes mad. Yeah. As an example of one that has gone mad, some of you, this is Bob who's going to be helping me with the videos. So as one that has gone mad, I don't know if any of you remember this advert.
"Hello, ladies. Look at your man. Now back to me. Now back at your man. Now back to me. Sadly, he isn't me. But if he stopped using lady-scented body wash and switched to Old Spice, he could smell like he's me. Look down. Back up. Where are you? You're on a boat. The man your man could smell. What's in your hand? Back at me. I have it. It's an oyster with 2 tickets to that thing you love. Look again. The tickets are now diamond. Anything is possible when your man smells like Old Spice and not a lady. I'm on a horse."
Okay, some people have accused me of being a bit sexist showing him, but any excuse, I don't think. So yeah, that's an advert that went viral. So why did it go viral? And we're looking at the role of figurative operations in this type of thing. So this had 53 million visualizations, views, so a lot. Just to contextualize what we're doing a little bit, so we're interested in the role of figurative operations, so metaphor and metonymy, in why things go viral, but that is never going to be the whole story. I think there's the key thing of who's in the video. So if you can get someone really, really famous in the video, it's more likely to go viral. We haven't got any control over that. But that costs a lot of money, yeah? The same with the environment. Adverts that first feature at the Super Bowl in the US also tend to go viral because millions of people see them already around the world. But what we're interested in, the thing that we can think about, is the message. So what's actually in the advert. So even though we're going to be saying things about metaphor and metonymy and how they affect the popularity of adverts, that's never going to be the whole story. It's just going to be part of it. We think that there will be an effect because in other aspects of advertising that are not viral, figurative operations, this is particularly metaphor, have been found to increase brand recognition, recall of the content of the advert, and consumer preferences. And I can dig out the literature for that if anyone's interested in. So there has been a literature on the static advert showing that metaphor does help advertising. But we're interested in, so we're saying yes, the presence of metaphor and metonymy we think is going to be important. We're moving this study out a lot more. Whereas the previous study focused mostly on metaphor and metonymy, here we're looking at a range of figurative operations, which I'll illustrate with videos in a minute. So we're looking at things like hyperbole and also understatement and irony, different types of irony in the advert. So we're looking at a range of figurative operations. We're looking at how densely packed they are, how much they spread over the advert, what they are, and the positioning. So there have been studies that have shown when you give people a list of things to remember, people tend to remember the first one on the list, well, this is me anyway, and the last one on the list. and everything that's in the middle people tend to forget. So, yeah. So we've got the hypothesis that if the figurative operations appear at the beginning, at the end, maybe they're more memorable, maybe they're more effective. So that's part of our hypothesis. So in this study, what we've done is we've got 40 videos with differing views. So we've got, some of them have just got very small number of views, and others have had millions of views. So they vary in terms of the viralization. 2 raters, and then we brought in a third person where we disagreed. It's actually quite difficult. Whereas identifying metaphor and metonymy is hard, identifying metaphor and metonymy and hyperbole and understatement and irony is a bit of a nightmare. So it's very, very tentative pilot thing here. And then, sorry, I can't say the word, statistical analyses to establish whether viralization is connected to all of these things. So we're just looking for relationships between these aspects of figurative language and whether they're likely to go viral. I've put this here because I mentioned this to my brother-in-law who works in advertising, and he just said, you're looking for the Holy Grail here. You're never going to find it. Everybody would like to know what it is about an advert that makes it go viral, because then that, you can line your pockets with gold. But so we don't know if we're going to find the Holy Grail, but we're going to look for it anyway. So he's not put us off. So this is the data collection. These are the videos that we gathered. The figurative operations. So I'm going to take you through each of these by showing you examples of viral videos that have got them in. So with metaphor, so this is basically where one thing was compared with another. There are 2 key types of metaphor that people talk about in the literature. So there's resemblance metaphor, where something looks like something else. So when you go away from the session and say Jeannette was a monster, it could be because Jeannette looked like a monster, or Jeanette's behaviour resembled a monster in some way. Yeah. Looked or sounded or was. Correlation metaphor, these are metaphors that are kind of a result of our interaction with the world, our bodily experiences with the world. Some people may have heard this idea of conceptual metaphor. It's quite similar to that. So for example, things like when we talk about moving forward in time, it's almost like we're moving forward in space. Yeah? So we're looking forward to tomorrow, we look back to yesterday. And these are correlational things because they correlate our experience, it physically correlates with our experience in kind of more abstract way. Another example of a correlational metaphor would be good things are up and bad things are down. Yeah? Or closeness, affection is warmth. Yeah? So these are kind of more profound metaphors. And our theory was that maybe these correlation metaphors would have a stronger effect than the resemblance metaphors because they're more experienced, they're more felt. Metonymy, so here we're looking at sort of one thing standing for something that it's closely related to. Hyperbole, so massive exaggeration, and the opposite of that, understatement. Irony, verbal irony, situational irony, and dramatic irony. So verbal irony would be basically when you're sort of saying something which is kind of the opposite of what's expected, or it's not what's expected. Situational is when something unexpected happens, and dramatic is when the audience knows something that the person in the advert doesn't. So there's a lot of humour derived from irony. And the last one, just unmarked contrast. So this is just a change, but not necessarily experience any of these other figurative things. And then what we tried to do was to identify all of these operations in the language, in the images, and in the music that came in the advert. Because the advantage of these adverts is that you've got the sound as well. So you've got lots of ways of incorporating figurative operations. To illustrate some things, metaphor, here we've just got, this is not a video, this is just a very straightforward resemblance metaphor. Here, this is an advert for the World Wildlife Fund. Killing a tree is murder too, and you can see that the tree looks like a person. Okay, so it's like killing a tree is like killing. It's like, can you see? It's like a person, not a person with their head chopped off. I don't know anybody who looks actually like this. So anyway, it's like a tree without the head. Correlational metaphor. Remember, I said this is the kind of thing like life is a journey, or up is good, or affection is warmth. This is an advert that we determined between us that contained a kind of correlational metaphor of life is a journey. So moving forward through time is moving forward through space. I'm just going to show you a little bit of this advert now. If that's okay, Bob. Thanks.
It was my choice. And now I will question myself for the next few weeks, maybe months.
We had an option of 2 pathways to walk, and they led to 2 doorways. It was a bit confronting, actually, to be honest, to see these big signs and feeling like you had to choose and be self-conscious of how you perceive yourself, and perhaps if it lines up with how the rest of the world perceives you.
I went through the average door.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
No, I didn't even hesitate.
漂亮对我的概念来说，就是，像明星那种遥不可及的那种。我走的是一般。
Mas eu acho que é mais porque eu me arrependi daí.
Okay, you've got the picture here. So basically there's this idea, like, you choose your path in life, whether you're going to see yourself as a beautiful person or an average person. It's strange, isn't it? Strange advert. And the message is that we should all see ourselves as beautiful. Is it for Dove? Yeah. So that's an advert with correlational metaphor in it. The next one is metonymy. A is 4B. So here you've got something represents. So here you've got the idea of a trigger providing a kind of like mental access to a bigger thing to which it's related. Okay? So this, in terms of those people who, I know there's a few people in the room working on metonymy, this is a kind of part for whole metonymy. Within the metonymy literature, people sometimes draw this distinction of part for whole metonymy, where one part of something represents the whole of it. So somebody might say to you that you're at a party, they're pouring wine, and they say, would you like a glass? And you say, yes, I'd like a glass. If they just gave you a glass, you'd be very disappointed. Yeah, the glass means like the glass with the wine in it. Yeah. Or if you're moving, if I say I need to move this table and it's really heavy, I might say I need some muscle. If some muscle just came and sat there, it wouldn't be. So it's kind of some muscle. It means the whole. And whole for part is the opposite of that. So here would be, say, for example, staying with the alcohol theme, you get home really tired from work and you say, I need a drink. Somebody gives you a glass of water, you're disappointed. Yeah, because a drink is a general term, but actually you mean an alcoholic drink. Also for whole for part, people might talk about, say, for example, there's been an accident, and in English we would say the police turned up. Now that sounds quite sort of neutral in English. That means the whole of the police stands for maybe 1 or 2 policemen. In Greek, that sounds really wrong apparently, because that does actually literally mean the whole of the police force. So we use this part for whole and whole for part. So this is an example of one for part for whole, and it's for New Zealand Airways.
Welcome aboard this Air Middle-earth flight. Before we set out on our journey, I would like to impart a story of safety.
Okay. Yeah. So here, you can see that immediately the music comes on, and that's all the metonymy for Lord of the Rings. Immediately, a lot of people are going, yeah, get that. And then you see her, and she's also leads you in a bit more, and then you see all the characters, and you're right in. So this is an example of metonymy working. It also, and this is what we really often find in these kind of adverts, it also then leads on to a metaphor. because here the journey on the aeroplane is a bit like, well, hopefully not, a bit like the quest in Lord of the Rings, hopefully less dramatic than that. But you've got this metaphor going on as well. It's really often that you find metaphor and metonymy occurring together. It's not often that you have metonymy just on its own. So that's a metonymy. The next one, this is a lovely advert. Hyperbole, massive exaggeration, something that you just wouldn't expect at all. And here, there's some hyperbole. Oh, well, you'll be able to see it occurs at a certain point in this advert. I won't spoil it for you, but you'll know when you see it. Okay?
And there's your beautiful baby.
Any day now.
Really? You're eating Doritos? He's eating Doritos on my ultrasound. See what I have to do. I know. Give me that.
Okay, so as you can see, the hyperbole is at the end there, because that would never happen. So that's an example of hyperbole, and that's one of the things about the figurative operation appearing at the end of the advert. The next one, understatement. So here is when people sort of massively what they say is much less dramatic or much less impressive than what you're expecting them to say. And here is an advert where there's understatement right at the end of the advert. This is an advert. Okay.
This hour isn't big enough for 2 zeros.
Anything you can do, I can do better. I can do anything better than you.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Anything you can be, I can be greater. Sooner or later, I'm greater than you. Any note you can reach, I can go higher.
I can sing anything higher than you.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can.
No,
Yes,
you
I can.
Is that all you got?
I'm up to my knees in 0 calories. Pepsi to the max, so let's drink all of it.
What's Snoop doing here?
We're tight. Pepsi Max, 0 calories, maximum Pepsi taste. P-E-P-S-I, Max.
Okay, so it's just that end bit. You see how the hyperbole, and then at the end, what's Snoop doing here? We're tight. We're friends. So we're tight. Just 2 words. So you normally expect more of an explanation here, something stronger, but just we're tight, and that's all, to explain this whole thing. So you've got the contrast there between the hyperbole and the understatement. Moving on to the 3 types of irony. So there's just the 3 types of irony to go next. Verbal irony, so this is where people say something that's kind of perhaps the opposite of what they mean, or different from what they mean. I'm just going to show you the beginning. This is, again, back to the man on the man, your man.
Hello, ladies. Look at your man. Now back to me. Now back at your man. Now back to me. Sadly, he isn't me.
It's that, sadly, he isn't me, yeah? Actually, he means, I'm quite pleased he's not me, yes? So it's kind of the opposite of what you'd expect. Situational irony, this is where something unexpected happens. I'm just going to show you a little bit of this one. An advert for Evian that you may recognise. Okay, so that you've got something unexpected happens. So you're expecting to see a visual of them, and it's not them. Okay. The third type of irony, dramatic irony, is where we as a viewer are aware of something that the person in the advert is not aware of, and that creates kind of humour and tension. And just to show the dramatic irony, this is one. horrible, it's cruel, isn't it? So you get the picture there. We were aware of something. And the very, very last one, before I come on to the analysis of these, unmarked contrast is just when there's lots of sudden changes, but it's not necessarily figurative in any of these other ways. And this is an example of an unmarked contrast. Oops, maybe not. So here, what we've just got is lots and lots of sudden scene changes, one after the other. Because we were interested in a lot of these figurative operations, we've got this idea of contrast. Is it because they're figurative that they're popular, or is it because of the contrast? So this is to allow us to just rule out the contrast. So that was the fun bit with all the talk. And that's just a summary of what we're interested in. And we're interested in the number and the percentage of these, so the coverage and the amount of these operations. How did we code this? We used a piece of software called Nvivo. I don't know if you're familiar with this. It's for qualitative research analysis. The Uam Corpus Tool is the cheap and cheerful version of Nvivo. But Nvivo, you can do more sophisticated things. You code up the different types of responses, and then it gives you a chart that shows what's happening here. And this is the video here. So remember this advert for the baby, yeah, for the Doritos? This would be an example of how we coded this up. So all the way across we've got situational irony in the words and in the pictures, because there's all sorts of unexpected things happening one after the other in this advert. Metonymy and metaphor at the point where the baby starts playing ball with the dad, because you've got the metonymy in the Doritos is starting to represent the ball. No, the metaphor, visual metaphor, where the Doritos is representing the ball, and then the metonymy where that stands for the whole sort of father-son relationship that is yet to come. Unmarked contrast, where we have the kind of sudden change in scene, and then the hyperbole right at the end when they're all screaming, yes, and hyperbole in the verbal and in the image. So that's how we marked that one up. That's an example of how we marked them up. So we've got this dynamic thing. It shows whereabouts they occurred in the screen. In terms of coverage, so here, because we have this visualization of when they occurred, we're able to see the percentage of things that's covered. So here we've got situational verbal irony. Here we've got, this is 76% of the advert plus another kind of 10%, and so we can see how much of the advert contains some sort of irony. And then here, this one is for hyperbole, and how much of it is in the advert. So this is kind of like how much of these are in the advert. In terms of density, what we did here, I just whoops. So with density, we see how much of the how many of the different figurative operations are occurring at a particular time. I'm thinking it should show us, yeah. So this is a little bit complex, but basically we've got the 4 quadrants of the advert, and in this first quadrant, divided again into 4. In this first part, there's irony here, irony, some metonymy, some irony, situational. So we added up and got a total of 12 instances of kind of figurative operations. And here there's more. There's 14, then 10, then 7. So this gives us kind of how much of it is co-occurring at once. So basically, the take-home thing there is how much does it spread across the advert, and then how densely packed is it that we're interested in, and then where does it occur in the advert. And for the dependent variables, that's the number of views. So our findings, our main finding was that in terms of coverage, so how much does it spread across the advert, the big predictor, so there was prediction overall for figurative operations as a whole, but the big predictor of popularity is irony. So the ones that are most popular are the ones that contain irony, dramatic irony in general, so verbal, visual and musical, but also situational irony in images and situational irony in pictures. So irony overall is really important in these adverts. Dramatic irony, so where the viewer knows something that the person in the advert doesn't. I think that's because that creates humour. And humour is a very, very difficult thing to measure kind of objectively. Irony is kind of easier to identify, but the humour comes out of that. And a situational irony as well, so the unexpected things happening. The other big second predictor in terms of coverage was hyperbole. So something massively exaggerated and strange. When people see visual hyperbole, particularly, it's the big thing. So in terms of coverage, we've got irony and hyperbole, and coverage overall is significantly positive. In terms of density, in terms of how many figurative operations are occurring together at the same time, we found here that actually the more that occur at the same time, the less popular it seems to be. And that kind of maps back to our first study, showing that if there's a lot of different things going on in the same time, people perhaps don't like that so much. Perhaps it's just too much going on at once, too much to process at once. So we've got different kind of ways of explaining these findings. The irony creates a surprise effect because of the contrast involved, and the exaggeration or the hyperbole enhances this feeling. We think that's what's going on there. And the images engage the emotions more than words. So it seems to be, in images seems to be the key thing here. One reason why we've got perhaps that the irony and the coverage is important, but the density is not so important. It relates to this idea of this optimal innovation hypothesis. I don't know if any of you have come across this. It's quite interesting, proposed by Rachel Giora et al. And this idea is that people don't like things if they're very simple. They don't like things if they're really complex. They like things that are sort of in the middle, particularly for where figurative operations are concerned. So if things are very sort of literal, it's not appreciated. If it's massively figurative, maybe not. But if it's kind of got an optimal amount, then it becomes something that people will appreciate. Another reason for our findings is that we think, when we looked back at our data, we found that irony behaves differently from metaphor and all the other figurative operations. It tends to come in longer strands. You tend to get this irony running all the way through the advert, whereas metaphor, you get a sample here, one here, one here, one here, and one here, which is why we get the coverage linking with the irony, I think. And whereas metaphor and metonymy come in sort of shorter, snappier things, as you can see in this article. In terms of positioning, when we look for correlations, so overall correlations and then individual ones, between where the figurative operations were and whether that correlated with popularity, we did indeed find that when there's a lot of figurative operations at the end and at the beginning, they tend to be the more popular adverts than the ones where it all occurred in the middle. And that relates back to what I said at the beginning of the talk, where I talked about this remembering things that are the beginning and the end of the list. In psycholinguistics, in psychology, people talk about the primacy and recency effects. So if something's recent or at the beginning, people remember it. So our findings tended to converge with that. So our next steps are to attach the meters. Our meter doesn't quite look like this, it's a different one, but to attach the electrodes and get the details of how people are responding emotionally, because we're getting here, this is quite interesting. This is kind of, from the first study, it was kind of self-report data, like how popular people, how good people thought it would be, how effective people thought it would be. From this study, it's actual real kind of comparing it to how popular the adverts are. But for the next step is to look at actual online responses as people are experiencing the advert. We did a very nice, I'll come back to that in a minute. We did a nice exhibition in Brussels because this was part of the EU project. We had lots and lots of school children. They came in and they watched the adverts with the electrodes on them. And we could see very, very clear evidence of some of them, that electrodes shooting up. One thing that was quite interesting that we found that I think will affect the study design is that at first we had the children wearing headphones so that only they could hear the advert, and there weren't very strong effects. But when we took the headphones off and all of their friends were around them, the effects were much, much stronger. And I think this shows the social effect of how emotion is a social thing. It's experienced. When all of their friends are experiencing it as well, there was much more of a correlation between the dramatic things and the spikes on the software. Yeah, this is just basically shows, this is just a pilot that we did using some of this software, and it basically shows the kind of things it can tell you. So this is a study that we did where we just presented people with metaphors. These were actually computer-generated metaphors. That was kind of part of another study that we did. And they were attached to the electrodes. And as they saw the metaphors, which are represented by these red lines down here, we see that the EDA, electrodermal activity, responses to each of the metaphors. And here we have an example of a metaphor where there was a strong peak, where there was a strong increase in emotion. And this is the metaphor, art is beautiful love. And we contrast it with this one where there was no response at all emotionally, truth is stunning beauty. And when we look at when we asked afterwards what people thought about the metaphor, everybody thought they both made sense, but this one, they thought it was generated by a human, and this one, they thought it was generated by a computer. And our hypothesis is that there may be a relationship between people's emotional response to metaphor and whether they think it's actually generated by a human or not. And quality as well. They liked this one and they didn't like this one. So in terms of judging quality of metaphor, is emotional response a factor? The other thing that we're incorporating in, as well as measuring with the electrodes, we also want to ask people, because people maybe have emotional response to metaphor. It could be because they love it, or it could be because they hated it. You don't know, or reminded them of something really shocking, or it could be all sorts of reasons. So we're incorporating this questionnaire as well into that. And that's actually Paola, who's working on the project in Brussels with all the children there. And that's me done for today, I think. So I'm more than happy to welcome questions and things. Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm sure everybody will actually agree with me that Jeannette's talk is a nice banquet with a lot of great food.
Yeah.
That's a good
Thank you, it's a good metaphor, yeah.
So I think questions are welcome.
Yep. Dennis, yeah.
Yeah, so I was just quite fascinated by the viralization study. So I was thinking about the way you built your regression model, because you try to correlate your ratings about the advertisements with what you observe to be the views, right? But
yes.
I think the number of views is very much determined also by the dynamics within those that share.
Absolutely.
So I was wondering why don't you also survey the viewers about something like, to what extent am I likely to viralize this video?
This is exactly what we're doing. I'm really glad you asked that, because we've got another study. Oh. And actually, maybe if I give Danny the link, maybe he could circulate it around. You might be a bit biased actually after this talk, but this is exactly what we're doing with another study. We're asking a number of questions like, how likely would you be to send this to another person? Yeah, and so various. How do you like it? How likely would you be to send it to another person? They've also got to factor in things like, do you use all these various online social media sites? That study, it's taking a long time to gather the data, because we want to use a lot of adverts and we want a lot of participants, but we can't have a study where we show somebody like 30 adverts one after another, because there's a lot of boredom. So what we're doing is we're showing people 6 adverts at a time, and they're randomly allocated. But because we're doing that, it's taking ages to gather the data. And we're doing it across, again, we're doing it across English, Spanish, and Chinese. So thank you for mentioning that, because I meant to mention it, that we're doing that study. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. Whereas views is, it's nice. On the one hand, it's got kind of ecological validity because it's real, but on the other hand, like you say, there's so many other factors that will influence that, and who's watching, the age, the demographic, and everything. Absolutely, yeah. Which is why we're doing it with the same adverts, but with the questionnaires. But thank you for asking that. That's good, because I meant to say that. Hi, yes.
I'm interested in your use of electrodermal responses.
Yes.
To measure whether they understand proximity or whatever. But do you think that there will be certain time delay in the electrodermal response?
Yes, there is yeah.
So how do you know whether the electrodermal responses respond to that? Or,
yeah.
Or something much earlier on?
You're absolutely right, and this is, I think, is going to be a big issue with this electrodermal response. It's a very limited technology. I think it would be nice if we can see how we can map it onto the adverts, but the trouble with, the advantage of the adverts is that the message kind of builds up, and people draw on their own experience, and kind of things come into play all together. So it's not a linear process, understanding. So this will be a limitation of that. Yeah, we're very new to the EDA stuff. We've got the equipment and we're quite excited about it, but we're doing different approaches. So we've got one study where we actually had the students in the extended part of the first study where they're looking at the individual adverts. We've got those people wired up to the EDA equipment as well. So we've got the data for that, and that's just one static advert after another, which would probably be a little bit easier. But even there, we don't know why they're going to have a response. And also the previous advert might have affected it, it might be very different. So yeah, we're going to get massively messy data, and maybe it will be unusable, I don't know. But I think it's an interesting extra source of information to add to what we've got already, to see if it can kind of add another nuance to the kinds of things we're saying. But you're absolutely right, it's going to be a huge mess. But then I quite like data that's messy, because it's kind of it's kind of real. Yeah. Mm.
I thought you can define the latency window, right? So as long as you identify the specific stimulus, the latency is usually between 1 to 4 seconds, according to the literature.
Yes.
So I think if you have a spike, and if you know it's a specific skin conductance response, you can attribute it to the stimulus that you.
Yes.
Yeah.
From my understanding.
I think that 1 to 4 seconds is crucial, because the video will be quite dense with a lot of these things. So a person responds 1 second, a person responds 4 seconds will get you haywire.
So one way might be to design an advertisement, maybe, so to control it experimentally. So instead of using real advertisements,
absolutely,
you may just design something.
That's what we're.
The other way may be to stick electrodes around the brain.
Yeah. Yeah.
That will be more immediate response.
Yeah, for EEG.
Although there
yeah.
there is very fine eye tracking software and rate fixation on advertisements, which have actually show where people look on the actual page.
This is something that we've also been thinking of doing, because we've got an eye tracker in our department, and we're looking at how to hook up the eye tracker with the EDA response with the E prime, which is the reaction time thing, which actually measures the timing. And it's the issue of hooking up the three kinds of technology. This is something that we've been thinking of doing, because then you know exactly what they're looking at. Even then, it will still be a bit messy, because if they're looking at it, we still don't know what's. We're never going to get inside people's heads, but we're getting as close as we can, I think, with the various things. But I think it's quite exciting that these new technologies are coming online, and that we can hook them up together. Yeah, but you're right, and I think there's some nice eye tracking studies that have compared kind of literal equivalent. So they've doctored the adverts, and they've got kind of literal and metaphorical in them. Where do people look when it's metaphorical? Where do they look when it's literal? And it seems to be, they look at the picture, or they look at the top right hand bit first, and yeah. There's loads to be done. I think it's really good. Yeah. Yeah. Hi.
Question related to the first part of your talk. I was really surprised that there's no relation between complexity, figurative complexity, and the speed of comprehension. Right?
Yeah.
So that is the first question.
Yeah.
So related to that, I was wondering, like, how did you define the figurative complexity?
This is also a really good question, which I'm glad you asked, because it's something that I wasn't sure whether to put into the talk, because it's kind of a little bit going off at a tangent. But in this first study, we found that there's no relationship. The second study, what we found is that the decline goes from metonymy through chain of metonymies to metaphor to metaphonymy to metaphorical complex. What we found in the second study is that where you start to combine it, I'll put the slide up. Actually, it's a lot easier. Because it's right at the beginning, isn't it? This one. Yeah. See this cline across here: metonymy, chain of metonymies, metaphor, metaphonymy, metaphorical complex. What we found is that actually the reaction time goes up and then it goes down when you've got chain of metonymies, and then up and then down again with metaphonymy and then up. So it seems to be that when we've got complexity coming in, it actually speeds up the reaction. The metonymy provides access to the metaphor and people get it much more quickly. And also we found that relates to how much they like it. So we found it's not a linear relationship with the larger study. We found that it's this kind of relationship, and that when there's metonymy providing access to metaphor, that speeds up the processing of the metaphor, which is what we found with that. So
that really complicates the picture, but I think it more complicated than that. Maybe you consider metaphor as a kind of, you don't really distinguish the different kinds of metaphors. For example, the visual metaphors, they also have different degrees of complexity, right? So there are different kinds of anomalies in it.
Absolutely.
And some metaphors are very easy to identify, some are more difficult. So there are like endless variables.
That's the trouble. Yes. When you're looking at different types of metaphors and ones that rely on primary metaphors or ones that are more visual. Yeah, exactly. We haven't included that in the first part of the study. We haven't included that. In the second study, we've got the correlation and the resemblance, but not in the first part. That's probably something to look at when we're still writing that up. So that's something to look at when we try to explain the data. But I did find it was quite interesting that metonymy providing access to metaphor, speeding things up. I think that was really interesting because that goes with some of the theory of the origin of a lot of conceptual metaphors. Yeah, but be interesting to talk more about it because your study I think is similar. I think it'd be good.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Right.
How do you measure comprehension of the adverbs? So you say different people have different interpretations due to subjectivity. But you found that there's no correlation between the speed of comprehension and also the figurative complexity. So I just don't know exactly how do you define comprehension.
So the comprehension, this is a really difficult one to measure because we can't sort of say, make people explain it, because by the time we thought of an explanation, that's gone beyond comprehension, that's gone into interpretation. So what we did was we said, as soon as you've found some understanding of the metaphor, you need to click to say what it is. But to stop people from just clicking and clicking and clicking, because I think that would be very tempting to say, yes, I've got it, yes, I've got it, yes, I've got it. We said, right, and then we're going to ask you immediately, what is it that you thought the metaphor, the advert meant? So they click, and then they say what they think the metaphor meant, and we recorded what they said, and then they click, and then they say. It's not perfect because there's still a lot of subjectivity in it, but that's how we devised it. Yeah. So that's in a way we are getting at kind of initial response in a way. Yeah.
I don't know. I thought it was like you give them a multiple choice for them to choose. So you give them or you can do like a priming, like you give them some sort of cue and then to prime them at their comprehension.
We did give them a multiple choice in a pilot study, but then we thought that's massively skewing the response. It's not really comprehension because we're telling them 3 possible responses and they're just having to choose one of those responses. It might not be how they understood it at all, or it might speed up their response because they see, ah, yes, it's that. So that's why we did that in the pilot, and then we had to pull away from that because we thought, actually, it's not really comprehension. Comprehension is really, speed of comprehension is really, really tricky to get. I'm not sure about how priming would work.
So it's like if you, if the Grand Canyon stands for Arizona,
yes.
You can give them like Arizona associated prime versus a non-Arizona associated prime, then show them the metaphor and see which response is faster.
Yes, and I think that's really nice. So that's a different kind of study, I think, from what we're doing, but I think it's a really valid study because it suggests, do they get to the meaning? One thing that is presupposed in that kind of study is that there is a correct meaning. Right. And this is something that we found as we did more and more pilots. There's no correct meaning, because we did also have, in our pilot, we had correctness, how able are people to identify the correct meaning of the metaphor. But when we got the data, we thought, we can't do this because things like the Nvivo, and people see the electricity, that's no less correct because it's working than the kind of other things. All we're doing there is looking at how close they would be to a kind of like British norm, which is a different thing from correctness, I think. And I think that's something that we've definitely taken away from this study, is seeing that like the meaning doesn't belong to the producer. Even though we thought it did, we had our ideas at first. Yes, this means this, this means this, this means this. But it's actually quite difficult. But I like the idea of the priming to look at. The priming
you can still see the priming effect according to the different figurative complexities.
I think so,
if they're more complex, then you would expect probably no priming effect because it's just too complicated.
There's too much going on.
If it's just the pathway is very simple, then you will really get a very quick priming effect because they bring their assumptions.
That's really nice because that suggests that we can use the priming effect to measure complexity of the metaphor. That's really, thank you. I take that back because that's really good. Yeah. I
think we have time for one more question.
Yes. Hi, Dr. Chung.
Yes, this question probably comes not from a linguist, but from someone in sociology background. So I'm interested at one slide you show about different people from different countries responding to. Can you show?
Was it with the positivity?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that was very strange, that finding. Where is it?
Just any one slide because you.
That one. Oh, do you mean the different response? You mean the
how Spanish, English, Chinese responding to certain advertisement or.
Say, for example, this one.
Yes.
Yes.
Things like this. I wonder because they are responding to the same medium.
Yes.
And probably this medium is Western origin.
Yeah.
And hence it's but the Chinese would be interpreting this Western thing from their Chinese from the Chinese tradition and things like that.
Yes.
So I wonder, have you done the other way around, showing British, Spanish something which intrinsically Chinese?
That's exactly what we're doing in the main study now. So in this pilot study, everybody had to look at English adverts. So it was not fair. It was all one way. In the bigger study, a third of the adverts are from China, a third of them are from Spain, and a third are from Britain and America. And all participants are looking at all adverts, and they're all looking at them in their own language. So we translate. If we tried to use ones with minimal language, but where there is language, we've just translated it into their own language. So people are looking at adverts. So British people are looking at Chinese adverts. Spanish people are looking at British adverts, and that's one of the things that we're going to look at is how that affects response times and also the interpretation, because that was a big weakness of the first study, was that it was very kind of like an imperial study in a way, whereas now this is a more equal study, the bigger one. Yeah, because I think we're going to get more interesting stuff coming out of that.
So I'm afraid I'm push this issue further.
Yes.
Because the rural and urban dichotomy in China is still very wide.
Yes.
So advertisement is, something urban.
Mm. Yeah.
And even so, you are basically measuring how urban people in China.
We are, because it was all done in Ningbo.
Yeah, because
and Ningbo is very urban.
It's not that urban, but yeah, still.
But it's
Shanghai. It's not Shanghai. It's
for
not
me,
country,
but compared to my town, it's quite
yes,
urban.
It's not country. It's not.
It's not countryside.
You're not talking about Tibet. You're not talking about very rural areas.
Yeah.
And Bo is still a very.
It's
And then there's also another issue, and how do you put Hong Kong here in this map? Because we are too westernized, but we are Chinese.
This is what we're doing some stuff on, on Hong,
Yes, and then it's because China probably is not fair. China is too huge.
Well, I would love to do this with people in Hong Kong, because we've got this really interesting mix of cultures here. I think it'd be interesting to compare Hong Kong and Chinese responses, and then look at how Hong Kong relate to the British responses. It's something I would absolutely love to do.
Yes. Now, of course, this is an academic issue, but Hong Kong being part of China, and this politically, geographically, but in fact we are very, we are
culturally
contaminated.
Like those
politically correct by the Brits in the last 150 years.
Yeah.
But that would tell our cultural origin is actually a very interesting, being sort of a mixed product between Chinese cultural origin but Western educated.
Yes.
There's a unique place of Hong Kong and China. So but China is huge.
China's huge, and you can't generalize about China as well, because that's the thing. We can't really generalize from any of this stuff. We can just sort of say there is difference, and these are kinds of differences that people might be interested. But we can't really say everyone in China would have this response, because, like you say, there's the country and the city, and north and south as well is big difference. But I was wondering, when you get adverts that are written in Cantonese in Hong Kong, are they developed in Hong Kong? Because I know Hong Kong is a major centre for the advertising industries, I think, isn't it?
So actually.
And they're not. So they wouldn't originate in China. They would be from Hong Kong. So we would need to get different.
More of them are coming.
Yeah. So it wouldn't be appropriate for me to use these Chinese adverts here. It would be more appropriate to use Hong Kong adverts.
It will contaminate your experiment.
It will make my experiment more interesting and more complicated, which I like. But
also the same with the British, because I suspect sometimes the Scot will be responding to something different than English.
Yeah. Yes. In our study, there weren't any Scottish people in the study, but you could. Yeah. And particularly, well, even with things like the Boddingtons, the beer, the age of the participant would make a difference there. And also the region, because it's from Manchester, and it says the cream of Manchester, which actually is ironic for us, because Manchester, I don't know if anyone's got any associations with Manchester. Football, yeah. But for us, it's kind of a big industrial city that's not very beautiful. You might talk about the cream of Paris or Venice or somewhere, but not Manchester. So putting the two together is a kind of humour. There's a snobbery about Manchester that people from the south of the country have. They see Manchester as black, dirty, industrial, etc. But people from Manchester would be more likely to be quite proud of being from Manchester because of the music scene, the football, etc. So even there, you get differences in interpretations. Yeah. And I think, you're right. There's a lot of much more fine-grained analysis to be done, looking at where people are from and their background and everything, which is why we've got the qualitative part of the study, where we look at what people actually see in the advert and what they make of it. Because I think with statistics, you're really only ever on the surface, and you need to go down and find out what people are saying. Yeah, but it's a really good point about China. Maybe we'll head off to rural China to do some stuff as well. Yeah.
I thank you so much time for this seminar. Thank you very much for coming, despite it's actually a Saturday morning. And thank you very much, Jeannette, for the fascinating talk.
Thank you.